Welcome to today's virtual event sponsored by the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and the Great Lakes Education Project with our partners from EdChoice. And we'll be talking today about some school choice myth busting with our two featured speakers. In the wake of some pandemic policies and the deeply frustrating results that's resulted for students and families across Michigan, we've seen an uprising of parents demanding education options and an opportunity for Michigan to bust through some barriers and bring education freedom in a way we haven't seen in probably more than 20 years. So that's called our Let Kids Learn initiative. That's exciting. That's framing our whole discussion today. We'll be honored to hear from our guests from EdChoice, and we'll be introducing them momentarily. A note up front during the presentation, if you want to participate by asking questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you can use. Type your questions in there and I will be moderating them. And so please take note of that. We'll be getting to the main feature of our program momentarily, but for now, we wanted to get an update from the president of the Mackinac Center. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe Lehman. He's the president of the Mackinac Center. He's been with us since 1995 and been in the capacity as president since 2008. And has a few important updates to share. So I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. And I can honestly say, I don't think I've ever been happier to be introduced as a living person, because a couple of weeks ago, in fact, it was 2 weeks ago today, I was involved in one of those massive pileups on the interstate. It happened to be in central Illinois. I know that some of those pileups made the news, and I can now say that I know what it is like to be rear-ended by a semi-trailer in one of those pileups, and the kind of thing that probably creates a post-traumatic stress disorder in some people. So I will just say that never for a moment did I doubt that good Samaritans there on the scene would help me out. I was not hurt, and they made sure I got out of the blizzard. And it was another reminder that America is a great country and Americans are good people. And a reminder of how important civil society is. And we need strong civil society to take the best advantage that we can of educational options, as many legal options as we can get. And so today's program is very important. I know you're here in part because you support the Mackinac Center, and we have been very active in helping the state of Michigan especially, but really the whole country, navigate through the lockdowns that were imposed when the pandemic struck. The accomplishment we're proudest of is a victory at the Michigan Supreme Court, which overturned more than 180 executive orders issued by Governor Gretchen Whitmer. They were found to be unconstitutional and beyond the powers delegated to the executive branch by the legislature. And so the Attorney General is now making an attempt to reimpose some of the ability to impose those executive orders, and we'll be continuing to fight for full and free exercise of our civil rights, and so that the voice of the people can be heard by heard through the legislature instead of being ignored by one governor making rules for 10 million people unilaterally. We're also very concerned about the amazing amount of money the state of Michigan is taking in right now. You would not know that there was a crisis going on if you just looked at the income of the state. And several states are experiencing this right now, record income, not just money from the federal government, but tax receipts are up in almost across the board. And so we're looking at some ways to give Michigan income taxpayers relief, and the legislature is grappling with that right now. And I guess before I turn it back over to Ben, I can tell you, I can give you one piece of evidence that shows how important school choice is to the Mackinac Center. Our organization is 35 years old this year. And our board of directors has only given the staff 2 directives in its history on what policies to pursue, other than a broad free market agenda. One of those directives was to help make Michigan a right to work state. Well, we accomplished that in 2012. The only other policy directive was bring universal school choice to Michigan. And that is the subject of our priorities right now. And Ben, back to you for our program.
Thank you, Joe. And it is encouraging we have that North Star from our board and in pursuit of full educational choice, which really inspired the program today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers to you and then hand the floor over to them. First of all, we have Jason Bedrick. He's the Director of Policy for EdChoice. In that role, he works closely with local organizations and state policymakers to develop high quality educational choice policies that will benefit as many students as possible. Previously, Jason served as the policy analyst with the Cato Center's Institute for Educational Freedom, and he's also served as a legislator in the New Hampshire House of Representatives. He received his master's degree in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where he was a fellow at the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. Michael McShane has dedicated his career to education. He began his career as a Catholic high school teacher, and now he is a notable researcher in K-12 education policy and the leading researcher in hybrid homeschooling. We might hear a little about that, perhaps. Dr. McShane currently serves as the Director of National Research at EdChoice and is a regular contributor to Forbes. He earned his PhD in education policy from the University of Arkansas, an MED from the University of Notre Dame, and a BA in English from St. Louis University. So we'd like to welcome Jason and Michael and hand the floor over to you.
Ben, thank you so much. I'll just dive right in and kick things off. Share my screen here. So I have a new report out called Who's Afraid of School Choice? Examining the validity and intensity of predictions by school choice opponents. And the report has 2 parts. I start with this question, right? What is the most common argument against school choice? And that is very clearly, for those who have been involved with advocacy, the idea that school choice will destroy the public education system. And so one question we have, though, is, well, is that legitimately the case? So what we did is, well, put it this way. 30 years ago, that may actually have been a legitimate concern. Because the story that opponents of school choice tell is that, well, if you give everybody the option of leaving the public system and taking their money with them, the families that are the most interested in education, that on average have the best students, are going to be the ones to leave first. And that means that the public system is going to have harder to teach students on average and less money to teach them. That's going to reduce the quality of the education that they get. That's going to spur more parents to leave. And then again, you're going to have even harder to teach kids, even less money, and it's going to eventually lead to a death spiral. It's going to destroy the entire public system. Now, like I said, 30 years ago, before we had much experience with school choice, that may have been a legitimate concern, but people are still making these assertions without actually looking at the evidence. And so what this paper does is looks at the evidence. So we take 5 states, Arizona, Florida, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Ohio. You'll note they're not in alphabetical order. They're in the order of their EdChoice share, which is the percentage of students in the state who are participating in a private school choice program. So here I'm not talking about interdistrict public school choice. I'm not talking about magnet schools or charter schools. We're talking about vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and education savings accounts. People are most familiar with the voucher idea, the idea that the money in the form of a coupon, the public funds follow the child to a private school. Tax credit scholarships are similar, except that they rely on private donations for which donors get tax credits. The K-12 education savings account is sort of the new kid on the block. Some people call it vouchers on steroids, as though it's a bad thing. But the main difference between the ESA and the voucher is that you can use it for a wider variety of expenditures. So we're not talking about college savings accounts like the 529 plan or the Coverdell savings account. With the K-12 ESA, families can use a portion of what the state would have spent on that child at a public school. They can use it for things like private school tuition, tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online courses, special needs therapy, and more. So what we did is we looked at the 5 states that have the highest levels of participation in these programs and that are the oldest. All of these states have had school choice for at least a decade, several of them for more than 2 decades. And so the question is, over that period of time, what has actually happened to the public school system in that state? And what you see is, if you look at the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is also called our nation's report card, over the last 2 decades, all 5 of these states have experienced improved performance. So I think what you can do immediately is you can reject the claim that school choice is going to lead to the destruction of the public school system. You'll note too that all the highlighted squares here are where the state actually had gains that outperformed the national average. And this is both on the NAEP as well as the AP exams. Now you might say, well, wait a second, it could be that school choice is causing harms. It's just that those harms are outweighed by other policy decisions, right? Maybe they increased funding, or maybe they imposed some sort of new regulations, or they adopted a new statewide curriculum. Maybe there's something that they did that drove an improvement in test scores, and that outweighed the benefits or the negative effects of school choice. Well, for that, we turn to a different report. This is by our friends at the University of Arkansas, titled "Is More School Choice Associated with Higher State Level Performance on the NAEP?" And what they found after they run a regression analysis that controls for a variety of factors, per pupil spending, spending on teachers, how much, demographics, things like that. What they find is a strong and statistically significant association between education freedom and both academic scores and academic gains. And here in the paper, education freedom refers not only to having robust school choice programs, but also having sort of a light regulatory touch when it comes to the private sector. But it may be even more compelling than that is that there are 28 academic studies that have looked at in individual states at the effect of the introduction of a school choice program on the public school system. 25 out of these 28 studies find a statistically significant positive effect. And what they're doing here is they're looking at things like how far away is the closest private competitor? Within a 5-mile radius or a 10-mile radius, how many options are there? How many other private schools are there near this school? Also, how many, what different types of private schools? Is it all, one type? Are there 3 Catholic schools, or is there a Catholic school and a Montessori school and a classical education school, right? And so what they find is that across these different types of measures, the more competition that there is, the stronger the effects. So one of the most recent studies by David Figlio finds that we find evidence that as public schools are more exposed to private school choice, their students experience increasing benefits as the program scales up. This was a study in Florida, which is the largest private school choice program in the country. There's more than 100,000 low and middle income students who are participating in this program. And when they say that there is improved performance, they're talking here not only about the higher standardized test scores in reading and math, but also things like lower rates of suspension and absences. And again, as the program scaled up, the size of these benefits increased, which again is the opposite of what the opponents of school choice predict. They predict as there's more school choice, it's going to be worse for the public school system. In fact, as there is more school choice, as there is more competition, the public schools improve in response to the expanded choice and competition. So I think we can safely say that the opponents of school choice in their prediction that the public school system will be destroyed are Chicken Littles. A second question that we had in this study is whether school choice opponents modify their rhetoric based on the size and scope of the proposal. Now, why is this important? Well, because in many cases, you will see that state legislators say, well, you know, I would love to have a universal program to help every single child, but that's just going to be too scary. The opponents are going to really ramp up the rhetoric. And so, you know, if we come in with something a little more modest, you know, maybe just for students with special needs, maybe just for really low income students, then it's not going to be, it's not going to draw the same sort of fire from the opposition. So let's see, is that really the case? What we did is we took a look at the 5 states that passed new school choice programs last year. You'll see that 3 of them, Kentucky, Missouri, and Arkansas, all had about 40 to 50% of students eligible for the new school choice program. But because of the way it's funded, in each of those states, fewer than 1% of the kids in the state would actually be able to receive a scholarship. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you had West Virginia and New Hampshire. In each of these states, the funding formula was tied to the public school funding formula. So every eligible child would actually receive a scholarship, or in these cases, an ESA. In New Hampshire, about 1/3 of students were eligible. In West Virginia, more than 90% of students were eligible. So you might think, okay, you know, in West Virginia, that's going to be the state where you're going to see the most intense rhetoric, you know, doom and gloom, this will destroy the public school system. Whereas in, let's say, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, you might see more moderate rhetoric. They'll be expressing concerns, but not in the same sort of catastrophic way that they might in West Virginia. So who said this? I believe this bill would be the beginning of the end to public education. Well, that was Governor Andrew Beshear of Kentucky, which, as you remember, only about 1/2% of students in the state would actually be able to participate. But he said this is the beginning of the end of public education. What we did is we put together sort of a 1 to 10 scale from mild to catastrophic that measured the level of rhetorical intensity, right? So we were looking at what politicians were saying, what people were saying in media, you know, in op-eds and editorials, testimony that was given before the state legislature, statements that were made publicly by various interest groups or you know, public school groups. We also, in the spirit of Spinal Tap, found that people turned the rhetoric all the way up to 11. So we added an 11th category for apocalyptic rhetoric, talking about destroying, dismantling, eliminating, or ending public education, etc. What we found was that the average was about an 8, or severe. So talk of, you know, harm, draining money, weakening, diminishing, etc. But if you look, there is really no correlation between the size and scope of the bill and the level of rhetorical intensity. So take a look at West Virginia. They had the largest, you know, the most expansive bill, but the level of rhetoric was at that average of an 8. New Hampshire, which had the second largest, actually, its rhetoric was slightly below. And you look at Arkansas, Arkansas had the lowest, so the smallest program, fewer than 0.1% of kids in the state could participate, but they had the most intense level of rhetoric. We also found that in every single state, somebody cranked it all the way up to 11. So even in Arkansas, you had somebody saying that this would be the final nail in the coffin of public education. This was a state rep. A state senator in Kentucky said that public education has its neck inside a guillotine, ready to have its head cut off. The Kansas City Star in Missouri said that this was a step toward the dismantling of public school districts, right? So there's no evidence that reducing the size and scope of the bill is actually going to lead to the opposition moderating their rhetoric. What you do lose, however, you don't gain anything, but what you do lose is support for the bill. So in our most recent Schooling in America survey, when we ask if people support having education savings accounts available to all families or just available based on financial need, we see that 3 out of 4 people say that they want a universal program. But if it's needs-based, it ends up being 50-50. So by reducing the size and scope of the program, you're not actually causing the opponents to moderate their rhetoric. What you are doing, though, is losing support for the bill on your own side. So in conclusion, there is no reason to believe the squawking from the Chicken Littles. Therefore, we believe that legislators should be bold and they should propose school choice for all. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Mike McShane.
Awesome. Thanks a million, Jason. So continuing on this theme, we're going to do some more myth busting. Let me fire this up here. And then... Everybody see that okay? Slides, dynamite. Well, so it's great to be here with all of you today. Like Jason, I'm talking about a recently published paper that I called the accountability myth. So stop me if you've heard this one before. School choice is bad because public schools are accountable and private schools are not. If you've spent even a moment's time advocating for school choice, sitting in a hearing about school choice, reading an op-ed about school choice, chances are you have encountered this argument. It's one of the most common ones that the Chicken Littles that Jason so thoroughly skewered like to use when they oppose school choice. Now, how do people like me, like Jason, like Ben, like our friends at the Mackinac Institute, now how do we respond to that argument? Well, I would say the usual suspects, and I count myself as part of this group. We love to say, no, wait a second. Private schools are super accountable, and in many ways, they're more accountable than public schools are. I mean, in the sort of traditional formulation of private schools, parents are spending their own money in school choice programs. They have a voucher or a tax credit or an ESA that they could conceivably spend in multiple different places. Their children are in the school every day, so they have a ground level view of exactly what's going on, and they have the opportunity to leave, to vote with their feet, to vote with their dollars. Private schools are more accountable than public schools are. Well, I want to be very clear. I totally agree with that sentiment, and nothing that I hope to say throughout the course of this presentation in any way seeks to undermine that claim. But given that that's the common claim that I've heard, something started kind of twisting in my brain, just kind of got stuck in my craw, as we might say back home in Kansas City. And it was that, you know, we focus so much on that part of the sentence that kind of is a dig at private schools. But I was like, wait a second, that sort of implies that public schools are held accountable. And I don't think that they actually are. So it's both parts of that statement are false. It's not that private schools aren't accountable, it's they are. It's that public schools themselves are not accountable. Now, obviously, this is something that is sort of just taken as a given in conversations about education. Well, obviously, public schools are held accountable, but I actually don't think that that's true. And that is the myth that I'm going to very briefly, obviously, I do it in much greater length in the paper, but in brief, I'd like to spell out my argument for y'all here. When we talk about accountability for public schools, I really think that we can mean different things by that, but roughly all the arguments that you hear fall into one of 3 buckets. We're either talking about financial accountability, they have to answer for the money that they spend. We're talking about democratic accountability, that they have to answer to voters. And we're talking about academic accountability, that they have to answer to the state or the federal government or to someone for the actual quality of the education that they are delivering. Again, I don't think that they actually are held accountable in any of these ways, but we'll go through, again, quickly, each of these one by one. So the first we want to talk about is financial accountability. So as I said, financial accountability is this idea that folks have to answer for, school boards, school districts, schools have to answer for the money that they spend. Now, a prerequisite for answering for the money that they spend is that people need to know how much money is being spent. It's sort of a necessary condition. It's not necessarily a sufficient one, but it's necessary to have this conversation. Now, we at EdChoice, in partnership with Morning Consult, poll a nationally representative sample of Americans every month and a nationally representative sample of teachers every quarter. We particularly do an oversample of school parents to get a representative sample of them as well. We ask them a whole host of questions. You can go on our website and see all the questions that we ask. But one of the ones that we ask is a basic factual question. We ask, how much do K-12 public schools spend per kid per year? Here's what we find. The median answer is about $5,000 per kid per year. And that's for just your average or the median American in our sample. School parents actually think that it is less than that. They think it's about $4,000 per kid per year. As you can see on the kind of right-hand side of this slide, depending on how much you actually count in there, and it varies a bit from state to state, the real number we're talking about today in 2022 is probably more around the neighborhood of $14,000 per kid per year. So the average American thinks that we spend about a third of what we actually do. The average school parent is almost closer down to like a quarter of what we actually do. So there's this basic misunderstanding of how much money is being spent. You cannot hold schools accountable for the money that they're spending if you're not even within the ballpark of how much it actually is. Now, interestingly, as I said before, we poll a nationally representative sample of Americans and of parents every month. We poll a nationally representative sample of teachers every quarter. So, question, do you think, we ask teachers the same question, do you think teachers are closer to the truth or farther away? Well, it's kind of a trick question because it turns out the average teacher thinks the same as the average American. They have no greater insight as to how much money is actually being spent than the average American does. I would argue that this is a concerted effort to keep people in the dark. That if you go to your state's website, your local school district's website, it is exceedingly difficult to access this information. Your average citizen, even parents, even teachers do not have access to this basic information, and therefore they are not able to hold schools financially accountable. Now, one quick plug that I want to put in, Project Nickel is a project that my colleague at EdChoice, Marty Lucan, put together because it seems like no government entity wanted to do this. This is a website, you can see the URL at the top of the page there, where you can actually look at school by school and see how much money is being spent. I imagine even some of you eagle-eyed observers of Michigan politics will be surprised that there'll be big variation even within the same school district. Schools that could be very close to one another spend wildly different amounts of money per kid per year, all for a series of decisions and policies and practices that happen kind of outside of the public eye, outside of accountability, right? So that's financial accountability. I don't think people have access to the basic information that they need to hold schools financially accountable. And therefore, very rarely do schools actually have to answer for the money that they spend. And I should say this is before even 3 federal coronavirus relief bills dumped the better part of $200 billion into America's K-12 schools. And we have very little understanding of where that money is going. This is in the before times. People just don't know how much this money is being spent, so they can't hold people accountable. So let's talk about that second one, democratic accountability, right? And again, this is something, if you're a school choice advocate, you've heard this a million times if you've heard it once. And that is that local school districts have to answer to school boards. School boards represent the will of the people. It's a democratic process, and that's what's holding them accountable. And private schools or charter schools don't have to answer to these democratic things, and therefore they're somehow inferior. Here's the problem with that. About 75% of school districts across the country hold their elections off cycle. And maybe Ben or someone from Mackinac would know the state of play in Michigan, but odds are that they're probably held off cycle. What does that mean? all of us know election day, beginning of November, when you're electing your governors, your representative, senator, president, all of those things. Election day. Higher amounts of turnout, lots of media coverage in the lead up. We talk about the election. We know who and what is on the ballot. We go in mass to our voting booths and we cast our ballots. Off-cycle elections are elections that are held at any time other than the usual election day. So a lot of school board elections are held in off years or in like a Tuesday in April. And we can see it's observed, and there's very little disagreement about this, even in the field of political science, that it has the effect of driving down turnout in elections, right? As you might imagine, more people show up on election day when everybody's on the ballot than on these kind of one-off elections when small numbers of people are on the ballot. What is the impact of that? Well, we see that organized interest groups play a much stronger role in low turnout elections, as you might imagine. If you only have to organize a smaller number of people to swing a low turnout election, it's much easier for you to do. You could be the only game in town doing that. We also see that elections can be timed and kind of gamed to get the outcome that people want. You see this around like school bond elections and a lot of other things, that the timing is done to try and kind of pick your electorate rather than actually reflect the people that are in your community. Now, interestingly, there have been movements across the country to make a very simple change, which is, well, why don't we just move these things off on cycle? And this actually happened in my home state of Missouri earlier this year. There was a bill to try and get elections moved on cycle, and the School Boards Association opposed it. So interestingly, the people you would think would want the most people to participate in their elections fought against a measure to actually have more people participate in it, which is a problem. So this prevents us from being able to hold schools democratically accountable because a smaller portion of the electorate participates. Organized interest groups play an outsized role, and it seems like those interest groups work to drive down turnout in those elections to avoid having to be held accountable. So that's financial accountability, that's democratic accountability, and let's close with academic accountability. I will return to my home state of Missouri. I figure as fellow Midwesterners, you always like to hear bad things that are happening somewhere else, though I imagine if I took some more time, I could find some similar information as I'm about to tell you. In the great state of Missouri, there are 517 school districts. And I don't know if you have any friends or family there, but you should call them and congratulate them, because as it turns out, all 517 school districts have at least some form of state accreditation. There are 0 unaccredited districts. 5 are on the kind of probationary, provisionally accredited, and the other 512 are all accredited. They all pass the muster that the state puts forward for them. Now, this doesn't mean that there's not a complicated process, that the actual document that just sort of determines how this accreditation happens, the MSIP, Missouri School Improvement Program, is like 100 pages long, standardized tests are given, all of this stuff happens, but when the actual rubber meets the road, everybody passes. Now, you might imagine, oh my goodness, this is great to hear. So obviously, all of the kids in Missouri, if all the school districts are doing well and they're taking all these tests and they're finding out all this data and they're all passing, obviously all of those kids are doing great. I looked at the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the test that Jason mentioned earlier, and I decided, because it's my home state, to be as kind as possible to Missouri. The NAEP has 4 levels of student performance: basic, proficient, advanced, and below basic, basically. So the lowest possible score you get is below basic. You can hit basic, you can hit proficient, you can hit advanced. I decided to say, look, we're not even going to talk advanced, we're not even going to talk proficient, just basic. How many students hit the lowest possible bar that the NAEP puts out? For 4th graders, between a 5th and a 3rd do not hit even basic levels of academic performance in math and reading. By the time you get to 8th grade, it's like 30% to a quarter, right? So depending on, at best case scenario, it's about a 5th of students. Worst case scenario, it's about a 3rd of students are not at the basic levels of performance. And yet all of these school districts are hitting their targets. They are not being held academically accountable. So I hope that I've persuaded you that we'll be happy to take questions about this. The traditional public school districts are not held accountable. They're not held financially accountable because no one knows how much they spend, so they can't even start having the conversation. They're not held democratically accountable because school boards are elected in low turnout, interest group dominated off-cycle elections. And they're not held academically accountable because even though there's this whole facade of standardized testing and data collection, the actual number of districts and schools that are ever sort of censured or fall under serious consequences for that behavior is actually quite small. And in some cases, like Missouri, 0. So where do we go with this, right? I would argue there's sort of 2 paths forward. One is to say, okay, let's kind of double down on this and fix this. Let's have more financial transparency. Let's move school board elections on cycle. Let's create accountability systems that have more teeth in them. And frankly, I'm not opposed to any of that. I think having school board elections on cycle is good. Having financial transparency is good. Where the rubber kind of meets the road is that, as we see with the, academic accountability systems and others, the system is just so geared to thwarting those things, to watering them down, to co-opting them, to preventing them from actually taking hold. And so academic accountability, depending on when you want to start, No Child Left Behind was in 2001, but states were having efforts in that even before that. Folks have been going at this in some cases 20, 30, 35 years, and the system has been able to kind of wriggle out of it. So what if instead of trying to continue to sort of wrestle with that, we go to the other path, which is more of what Jason was talking about, which is trying to think of how do we create opportunities outside of that system? How do we give people more choices? How do we allow more entrepreneurial educators to get in there? And how do we allow parents to hold schools accountable? So rather than having to have all of these complicated mechanisms in these other areas, let's have the people who have the most stake in it, parents who are putting their children into schools, be the folks who hold them accountable. So I'll stop there. And happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you both, Jason and Mike. Great presentations, thought-provoking. We should get some provocative feedback, I hope. Don't forget, if you're out there watching, have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. And don't leave here with that thought in the back of your mind that you didn't get answered today. I'll kick off the conversation though. I found it interesting. We'll start with Jason, looking at the 5 states that have the most experience with school choice as our test case. You know, the Mackinac Center, when I was preparing for this, I went back and looked. One of my predecessors more than 20 years ago did a piece on early attempts to myth bust school choice. But of course, at that time, it was largely theoretical. Now, as you said, we know a lot more. 3 of those 5 states that have had the most experience with school choice are just happen to be Michigan's neighbors, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, and should create a kind of a compelling case for people here. My question, though, is one of the pushbacks we get from people within the system is we're dealing with a state that has a long-term trend of declining enrollment, and we're losing students, we're losing population, and particularly urban school districts. Anytime you bring up educational choice, educational freedom, serving these kids, the pushback is we're going to just send these declining enrollment districts into a tailspin. Any thoughts on how you respond to that kind of argument that will come up in this debate from time to time?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to point out is that the system is intended to serve the students, not the other way around. The implicit argument that the other side is making is, well, yeah, this school might not be the best fit for this child. It might be, failing to help this child achieve his or her full potential. But for everybody else's sake, we need to keep that child in. And that child, and that child, and that child, and that child, and that child. And they all have to sort of stay in the system that's not really thriving. Because if they leave, it's all going to fall apart. It's going to be even worse for the ones who remain. So first of all, I think that that has everything exactly backwards. Your child is not owed to the public system. And as a matter of fact, everyone is not better off by being forced to attend a particular school based on the location of your home, or, you know, I say forced because it is compulsory, and, you know, your tax dollars are taken from you to support the system. And then it's only those who can afford to leave that really have options. So, you know, especially for the lower income families that might not be able to afford to live in a district that has a higher performing school or afford private school tuition, they really are a captive audience in many cases. It actually is better for everybody, as we have seen from the mountain of evidence that I provided, that everyone is better off when everyone has options. Take a look at Florida, for example. The idea, you know, you hear this, oh, well, the private schools are just going to cream. All the best students are going to leave. Florida shows actually the opposite. So they have a longitudinal study that they do every single year, and they look at the students. One of the things they do is they look at the students who are entering the program for the first time. And what they find is that they are lower scoring on average than their demographic peers, right? Now, that doesn't mean the quote unquote dumb kids are the ones who are leaving, but what it does mean is the people whose children seem to be doing well in the public system don't have a strong incentive to leave. They tend to keep them there. It's the ones where that child is, it's just not the right fit for that child. That child is struggling in that system. They are the ones that have the much stronger incentive to leave. And so even if you did nothing else, even if the schools didn't respond at all, you already have the average test for that public school going up as the lower scoring students leave. But here's the other thing. Those lower scoring students, within just a few years, they're performing at the national average, even though demographically, these are lower income students. And so that means they are outperforming their demographic peers. So it is, in the end, better for everybody when parents are empowered to choose the learning environment that is the right fit for for their child.
And I just want to, can I add one thing onto that? Because I think
Please.
that it's a really interesting, that kind of story of declining enrollment school districts and what the impact new policies might be. I'm from, as I've mentioned before, so I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. And it's interesting because, you know, Kansas City is a school district. And I imagine you could probably hear this story a couple times in Michigan. I think at its peak in the 60s, had something like 75,000, 85,000 kids in it. And by the time like the late 90s rolled around, it had dropped in more than half. And then charter schools came in, and Kansas City has a very large charter school population. So now the traditional public school district has something, I don't know, 15,000 kids or something like that. But so it's sort of like you see that meme where like, you know, who caused this to happen? It's like the 80% of the decline or whatever happens before school choice ever takes place. Then a school choice bill comes in and folks say, oh my goodness, how did school choice do this? And it's like, well, no, I mean, this was a trend that was happening long before then. We can think about the secular things that are happening. And there's also the idea that one of the reasons that people move out of places is that they don't have access to high quality schools. So actually having neighborhoods and cities and communities that have great schools in them might actually attract people to live there. And so we won't always have areas that are in decline. And we've seen in sort of micro cases in various different cities across the country where dynamite schools can revitalize neighborhoods and get people to want to move into them. So I think that the sort of the premise of a lot of that question has a sort of picking up the story in the middle and assuming a future, which I think if any of us have looked at current events in the last, I don't know, couple of years, making really solid predictions about the future can end up in embarrassment.
We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I'll get to those momentarily, but I did have a question for Mike, because speaking of the last couple of years, just get on the record, Michigan is actually one of these states where we do have school board elections on cycle. So we'll be having those in November. I'm not personally convinced that we have an informed, engaged electorate when it comes to those. But I'm curious, in light of what's happened in the last couple of years with COVID, and I think this may be especially true in Michigan. We saw it in Virginia for sure, parent uprising, awareness. To what extent do you think this active parent engagement in local school board issues, and even in interest in running for school board seats. To what extent do you think that kind of offsets what your point about the lack of accountability in the public school system?
Yeah, no, it's actually a great point. And it's funny because I remember when this must have been a couple of months ago when it was something I think COVID related. I remember seeing on Twitter Jay Cutler, who had been the quarterback of the Bears, and I think he's married to some celebrity or something. He does this Twitter feed of like, I need to run for school board. And then it's like him trying to figure out how to run for school board, who's on the school board, what's happening. I'm like, this is my paper happening live as this man tries to figure out like, wait, who is on the school board? When does the election take place? What do they care about? So I want to be clear, like, I don't think that moving school board elections on cycle will magically fix all of these problems. Interest groups will still be very powerful. There'll be all sorts of asymmetries that parents face. And so I don't, again, this is another reason why I'm much more bullish on school choice, because I think the incentives are aligned better. Sort of taking the argument I make is kind of on the terms of the people who support, who don't share that vision that I do. But I do think that it's been really, I think, invigorating to see. I think a lot of people, and I don't want to dismiss that there have been some cases where like crazy things have happened in school board meetings and people have behaved reprehensibly, and we should be the first to say, if you're like threatening your local school board member, you are clearly in the wrong and you shouldn't do that. But the fact that people are passionate about their kids, passionate about what their kids are learning in school, passionate about whether they're in class or out of class, I think 99% of that is all for the good. We want people to be engaged in these conversations. This is part of living in a democracy and living in a society where we have to make decisions about what our kids are going to learn. So I've been broadly encouraged by a lot of what's been going on there. Now, the question is that sustainable? I think in lots of cases, in both micro and macro cases, we see school board elections where people are super fired up about something. I mean, in smaller terms, you might see an unpopular teacher or like a football coach or the cheerleading coach. People are upset that they're there, so we run some people on the school board because we want to make some of these key personnel changes in the district. And then folks have to be on the school board for a couple of years. And they're like, actually, we end up spending a lot of time talking about like janitorial contracts and stuff. So that energy can kind of run out. So I don't know what's going to happen. It could be that so much of this stuff was driven by the pandemic. And as the pandemic kind of recedes and those things happen, a lot of that will fade away, at least with respect to like public school districts and school board hearings and others. Because I think most parents don't want to have to go to every month's school board meetings and organize protests and such. But I don't know. I've been invigorated by it. I think it's great to see parents involved in this. And I don't really know where it's going to go in the future.
All right, let's go to the audience Q&A here. We have the one here that says, in a bureaucratic ossified system like public education, why do we think that competition with voucher schools also improves the public system? I guess the question is here, what kind of school choice policy does it really take to create a competitive effect? What does the evidence show us on that?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. So how is it, if they're so bureaucratic and ossified, how is it that we see that they are responding to competition? Well, I think one of the reasons that they are so bureaucratic and ossified is because there is no feedback loop, right? In most cases, families are attending the school that they're assigned to, that their children are attending the school that they are assigned to, and they're essentially a captive audience, right? And we know that funding is not the issue, right? In many cases around the country, the lowest performing districts are also the ones that are the best funded per pupil, because they get a lot more money for, students who are, on the free and reduced lunch program, things like that. So you take a look at Washington, D.C., for example, they have some of the worst schools in the country and they're spending north of $30,000 per pupil, right? So it's not the funding. So what is it? Well, it seems to be whether they are directly accountable to families or not. In wealthier districts, it's not that they have more money. Meaning, when I say wealthier, I mean areas that serve a wealthier clientele, so to speak. It's that they have the ability to leave if the school is not meeting their needs. They move to this community because, right, they exercise school choice through the housing market. They bought an expensive house in an expensive area, but that school district knows, hey, if we aren't meeting the needs of parents, we're going to go. But a lot of the lower income areas, they know that they have a captive audience. With the introduction of school choice, students start leaving the system. Well, there you have your feedback mechanism. Now, all of a sudden, it's getting back to school leaders. Wait a second, we got to change how we do things. We got to, utilize our resources in a more efficient and effective manner. And we actually have to provide a quality service that is going to keep families here who are affirmatively choosing to be here because they have the option of going somewhere else.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that some of those very same arguments were being made, what's it now, 40 years ago during so much of the deregulation era, right? How will competition affect such ossified industries as trucking, telecoms, airline travel? Folks thought that, what's competition going to do to it? Well, some guys down in Texas are going to start this airline. They're playing around with this thing called Southwest, and they're going to take that thing national, and suddenly everything's going to change. So it's amazing the ability for competition to, when people really do have those options and the freedom, the sort of deregulatory agenda takes place and the freedom is put there to affect even what we think of as very ossified networks.
We have a couple of questions here that I swear I didn't plan in the audience, and I'll try not to take away from your guys' time too much. But they're Michigan specific questions about, where is Michigan at with school choice? Are there barriers to, exercising choice in faith-based schools, constitutional barriers? I could go on about this all day. I'll give you the really thumbnail answer. Michigan does have the nastiest, probably anti-aid Blaine Amendment in our state constitution. It's because it's the newest, it's a new vintage. It's happened 50 years ago. What we need to know for our purposes is that the Mackinac Center is trying to build on a series of US Supreme Court decisions that have promoted school choice and religious liberty. We have a federal case. If you go to www.mackinac.org/kids, you'll find more information on that case. And hopefully, as we see the Let Kids Learn initiative go forward, that this will create the legal space to make that possible as well. So that's where we're at. Currently, we can't get private school choice into faith-based schools, but the Mackinac Center is here working hard on that.
Yeah, I would, Ben, I would just amend one word that you said. I agree with everything you said, but you said that Michigan probably had the worst Blaine Amendment in the country. I would replace probably with definitely. I would note to the questioner that around the country, all of these private school choice programs actually do allow faith-based schools to participate, with one exception, and that is the town tuitioning program in Maine. Now, two of the oldest school choice programs, a lot of people don't know this, two of the oldest school choice programs in the country are in Maine and Vermont. And they were both enacted in the mid 1800s. So the way town tuitioning works, it's essentially a voucher if your town doesn't have a public school for certain grades. So in very rural areas, they may have a public school for grades like K-3, but then starting in 4th grade, you get a voucher and you go either to a public school in a neighboring town, or you can even go to a private school. Both those states used to allow religious schools to participate. But in I think the 70s, 80s, they changed the law to say only secular schools can participate. Now, in the wake of the Espinoza decision at the US Supreme Court in 2020, there is there were two lawsuits, one in Maine and one in Vermont. The circuit court, I forget which circuit court it was, I think maybe the third, but one of the circuit courts for Vermont ruled that they were in violation of the First Amendment as interpreted by the US Supreme Court in Espinoza. And so they had to allow religious schools to participate. The Espinoza decision basically said, states don't have to fund private education, but if they do, they cannot exclude religious schools because that violates people's, free exercise rights. If everybody has access to a certain benefit, unless they do it in a religious manner, that violates the free exercise clause. In Maine, however, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Souter, sitting on, I think, the First Circuit Court of Appeals, came to the opposite conclusion in their lawsuit and said, no, there's a difference between religious status and religious use. So, there's no problem going to a school that has a religious affiliation so long as it doesn't do religious things. And so because there's the circuit split, you've got the Carson v. Macon decision, that's the one in Maine, has gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Oral arguments were, I think, back in November or December, and we expect a decision later this year to see if there really is such a distinction between status and use. I know that Justice Gorsuch says there isn't. He says, look, if a Baptist man sits down for dinner and he says a prayer before he eats his food, is that a Baptist man eating dinner, or is that a man eating dinner in a Baptist way? It's really a distinction without a difference. And so we hope that they do rule in Carson v. Macon that there is no such status use distinction, and that all religious schools are able to participate in these sorts of programs. We're also very hopeful. I know the Mackinac Center has been doing phenomenal work trying to fight against this, frankly, very bigoted Blaine amendment, or you've got sort of a post-Blaine, uber-Blaine amendment. But we wish you great success in your efforts to repeal that and advance school choice in your state.
Thank you. Yeah, there's one last question I'd like to get in here. I'm keeping one eye on the clock. We have about 1 or 2 minutes. So if you guys can give me one or both, you give me a quick answer to this from our audience. Is anyone aware of any state run by Democrats that have significant school choice? So the political question.
Yes, I think Illinois is the best example of that, where you had a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor that came together to enact a $100 million tax credit scholarship program a few years ago.
But of course, the red wave we saw last year in the year of school choice, were there any examples in the recent wave of states that have any Democrat majorities or Democrat governors?
Well, not new programs. I mean, Rhode Island is a very small program, and there have been advances. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, you had a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor that expanded their existing tax credit scholarship program. I'd have to go back and look at the list. Maryland have a Democratic legislature, Republican governor, right? Yeah. So there have been a few places where there's been sort of a bipartisan agreement to expand existing programs.
All right. Well, I hate to cut off this great conversation because us wonks like us can go on all day, but I really appreciate both Mike and Jason bringing EdChoice's collective wisdom and busting some school choice myths today. And I hope our audience got a good taste of that and some good information to take home with them. So thank you both for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. Much appreciated. For those of you out there who may be past supporters or maybe new to the Mackinac Center, just want to thank those of you who've been contributors in the past, and also encourage you. It's your support that allows us to continue doing the work we're doing and advancing things like school choice and the Let Kids Learn initiative. One final note for those of you who will be interested in following up on this event, we have you bookmark the events page on our website, www.mackinac.org/events. We'll be putting up the video of this event. You'll be able to go back and check that out soon. Again, thank you so much for joining us for our event with School Choice Mythbusting with our friends from EdChoice. Enjoyed having you, and have a great day.
Thanks for having us, Ben.